Hello everybody. Welcome to another video from Work Organisation, Labour and Globalisation. Today I'm really excited to announce a very important special issue that really couldn't be more topical. It has a very special meaning for me because when I started researching workers 50 years ago now, half a century ago, one of the first groups of workers I looked at were what we would now call tech workers, whose occupational identities and whose labour processes were unimaginably different from what we see now. You had these guys who worked for big firms who did the maintenance on mainframe computers, who were kind of somewhere between technical workers and managerial and professional workers. The managerial workers all wore suits and worked 9 to 5, and the production workers wore overalls and worked shifts. And there were these guys called computer operators who wore white coats like scientists to signify they had this kind of different technical status. And they worked shifts like the manual workers, because the mainframe computers had to be kept going round the clock. But they were also very differentiated from those manual workers, and they had a lot of freedom to move around the building. And their occupational identity was extremely complex. They were very likely to join trade unions, but they also saw themselves as very different from the manual workers. And in the early 1980s, I did a study of the data entry workers, who were nearly all women, unlike these computer operators who were mainly men. And it was extraordinary to see how these women computer operators were actually locked into the rooms where they worked, because they were working on confidential data. The computer operators had complete freedom to move in and out wherever they liked in the building. And these women were locked in. And one year, just before Christmas, they were locked in on Christmas Eve. They all wanted to leave early to do their Christmas shopping. And they were supposed to wait for the manager to come and wish them all a happy Christmas. And that year, the manager got drunk and forgot. They were locked in until midnight, had to be released by a computer operator. So that just shows you how gendered it was, and what a difference there was between the status of these computer operators and working class people who were doing the more routine work. But also programmers added the first study of what we would now call teleworkers, who were programmers who worked from home, who were nearly all women. This was in the late 1970s, early 80s, and they worked from home, but not in the way that we would imagine teleworking, because the technology they had for communicating the data was, it was even before the days of the dial-up modem. They had a thing called an acoustic coupler that was like a phone handset that you plugged in to a receiver, and the data was transmitted so slowly you could see each character as it came up on the screen at the other end. So that was a completely different world. And you have now had the brilliant idea of putting together a special issue that looks at the occupational and class identities of tech workers in this completely new conjuncture in the 21st century. So I have to start by introducing our two guest speakers who we're so lucky to have on this video. The first is Valentin Niebler, who is a doctoral researcher at Humboldt University in Berlin, who is the lead guest editor for this special issue and also contributed an article. And our second participant is Niebler Soares, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Yale Law School in the United States, and also a fellow at the Institute for the Cooperative Digital Economy at the New School in New York. But his research was mainly carried out in Brazil. So he has a lot of different perspectives to bring to this conversation. So I'm going to start with you, Valentin. Please tell me, what was the thinking behind this special issue?
Yeah, thank you for this nice introduction, Ursula. So, I mean, I can start with my with what brought me personally to think about tech workers, and it was actually like it is often the case, research on other things. So, I was part of a research project, as you know, on gig workers and on low-paid workers in the gig economy, in the platform economy. We were looking at working conditions and also collective action. And I did some research in Berlin looking at cleaners, Uber drivers, and also at some of the protests. And I realized actually two things. First, that there is now, like I think 10 years or 15 years after these platformized jobs came up, a lot of research on low-paid workers, but not so much knowledge about actually the people who produce the applications, who produce the platforms, who actually, who are designing the interfaces that platform workers are using. So that was in my mind. That sparked a curiosity about what these tech workers are doing. And then at the same time, I also saw in around 2021, there were a lot of collective actions, a lot of protests in the platform economy in Berlin. And I was surprised to see actually some tech workers, software engineers who were actually part of the protests. Sometimes they were not from the company, but from other companies, but they sort of identified with this tech industry and were part of the movements against the company. They showed sort of a class consciousness, it seemed to me. And I think that was, yeah, that I found super interesting. And I didn't find too much current, as you said, research on this current conjuncture and the role of tech workers. So that's why Helene, Sandra, and um, uh, Helene, Sandra, Felix, and me thought of the special issue or collective volume on this topic. Yeah,
Right.
that's what got us
Well,
started.
you're using this term tech worker. Uh, could you explain what it is and why you think that's an important term?
Yeah, sure. So it's a good question and also, a question that doesn't have an easy answer, I think. So if I talk of tech workers, I think I talk of what usually is talked about as a software professional or IT professional, software engineer, maybe a UX designer, user interface designer, maybe a data scientist. So basically people who um, are involved in programming and maintaining the digital infrastructures that we use every day. And I think that would be the first obvious answer. But then, of course, and that's something I try to describe in the article I've been writing, it's a bit more complicated also because of the political movements that have used the word tech workers.
Yes. Well, you have studied tech workers, if I understand correctly, but both in Germany and in the United States.
Yeah, exactly.
Could
So,
you, how would you categorize the way that they see if you like, their class position? And would you see this as different in these two different geographical contexts?
mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, first of all, maybe it's good to say what kind of movement in the political sense we are talking about. So, this term of the tech worker, and I think that's where it also gets politicized, comes up or becomes more popular from around 2017, 2018, basically after Trump comes to power the first time. It's sort of, sort of a reckoning among software professionals about their political role, but also about their labor conditions. So it starts, at least publicly in the United States, that tech workers, IT professionals are kind of looking at their own role and try to politicize it. And they started, I think, a movement that had resonance across mostly the Western world, but also beyond it, and led to the foundation of chapters across the world. And one of them is in Berlin, where I mostly did my research, did some ethnographic research on a collective of tech workers. And I also went to the US to talk to tech workers and organizers. I would say that there is a fairly similar understanding among the tech workers I talked to of how they see themselves. They see themselves, and that's it might sound very obvious to us, but they see themselves as workers, at least the ones that organize and that I talk to and who unionize. And seeing themselves as workers was, for most of the people I talked to, a kind of new and sometimes also weird thing. So a lot of people told me I think they would tell me about sort of awakening moments or moments of realizing they were not just professionals or creatives. I think that's an issue we have with a lot of um, white collar professions, also academia, that people don't really consider themselves as workers. And that's something that happened, I would say, at least in the Western world, but also beyond, from 2017 on, when there was when there was a start of this tech worker movement. And I think broadly, just to say, I would say, yeah, they try to see themselves, or they start to see themselves as workers, and they mainly ask questions among each other and politically where to fit in a labor movement.
Oh, thank you. I'd now like to turn for a moment to Kendall, because Kendall, you've done a lot of your research in Brazil, and back in the 1980s, before the era of globalization, I can remember that Brazil, like India, was one of the rapidly developing nations that was had a policy of import substitution. It was trying to develop its own software industry to avoid importing from countries like the United States or Germany, indeed. So it had a rather different history. And I wonder if you could start by characterizing the tech industry in Brazil, which was the context of your research.
Yeah, I think, well, so I'm Brazilian. That's why I made my research in Brazil to begin. And I think when most of scholars think about the role of Global South in the International Division of Labor, when we're talking about the digital economy, they think about cloud workers, data workers. But Brazil, as you said, has a history of a software industry that goes back to the 70s and 80s. So right now, this national industry, IT industry, it's most of it's not as competitive as the global north ones, because we had these policies from the Brazilian state of a development model based on national companies that after the neoliberal governments from the 90s was broke. So our market became open to the global north big techs, but we still has this very with this working class with some high skills on IT companies. Like we have 2 million tech workers in Brazil right now. Most of them work outsourcing their service for global north companies, but also we still have some, and that's very interesting. We still have some public huge companies, usually in the extractivist economy sectors like oil and gas and mining, but that they need to develop some tech IT solutions for their business, for their core business. So part of our industry also develops like AI apply for oil and gas or mining, and our tech workers develop their own solutions to these national, 100% national Brazilian solutions for this kind of companies. Also, we have some relevant video gaming industry in Brazil, most for mobile, but also outsourcing for some AAA game companies from the global north, from Europe, from the US. And finally, we have some open free software movement with a huge tradition in Brazil. So in the early 2000s, for instance, we had some public policy for public procurement for free software for the Brazilian government's needs. And we had like almost 10% of our Brazilian state demand for software being offered by national free software cooperatives from tech workers. Unfortunately, that's not the reality anymore, but we have like this interesting tradition, and maybe in the near future we can come back to this. And my Brazilian research is about the tech workers from Brazil, new co-op initiative. So maybe we are going to change the game again.
Yes. And would you say that these Brazilian tech workers have like a large collective identity? Would they all identify themselves as tech workers, or do they have more specific identities linked to the sector or the particular kind of work that they're doing?
I think the term tech workers as a collective identity, it's kind of new, like from the last 10 years, but we started having like podcasts and mentoring initiatives and some YouTube channels about tech workers in Brazil. Usually in the past, people would say, I'm an IT guy, I'm an IT workers, like information technology work. But what most of them say, I identify as the name that is most competitive for my LinkedIn profile. So they are always changing how they call themselves. Like now everybody became AI specialists, because it's optimizing the chances to become hired again. So I think it's always a flexible identity, but also in Brazil, I think a very interesting thing about this collective identity formation, like a class identity, it's that in Brazil, most people, when they become a tech worker, it's generally a path for social mobility. In the beginning, it's a way to aspire to change your social class. But at the same time, I always say that the layoff is the best way, unfortunately, to remember that you are a member of a working class. So I think that the recent layoffs after the pandemic peak of hiring in Brazil, this make people remember again, unfortunately, in the most hard way, that they are members of a bigger collective of people with the same conditions and the same struggles.
Oh, that's very interesting. This idea of the pandemic as being a kind of turning point. I think it's so often the case. Like back in the 70s when I was working in the publishing industry, it was when people were made redundant that they suddenly discovered that they weren't part of a professional middle class elite. I think these moments of shock are very important for the development of class consciousness. Now, would you say that's a two-way identification? Do other members of the working class recognize tech workers as part of their class, or are they seen as privileged and middle class by, for example, production workers?
Yeah, another thing that I think it's relevant it's important to mention is that the remote reality of many of these workers also contribute to be more harder for them to identify and organize as a collective movement. But regarding the bigger view of the Brazilian working class about tech workers in our country, for sure, they are considered like privileged and they have higher payments. Like when you think about outsourcing, what is the minimal wage payment for US or German company? It's for a tech worker in Brazil. it's sometimes more than 10 times our minimum wage that the regular worker in Brazil receives. So for sure, they are considered a privileged part of the working class in Brazil. At the same time, they have these very precarious conditions, especially regarding the time they work. Like many of them work for 10, 12 hours daily, every week. Sometimes they don't sleep. So I think their families realize that although they have this condition of higher payments, higher salaries, they also have some precarious conditions that remember them that they are part of the working class, and the workers, like their family members, their community, their friends, realize this when they say, "But you can never go out. You spend your whole life working or studying to become a better professional." So I think this it's interesting. And also we have these new beginning movements of tech workers that realize and organize with bigger movements of workers, like with the traditional ones, like the homeless workers movements in Brazil has a tech worker sector. The unions are starting very slowly to try to make bridges between the traditional movements of workers and this category, the tech workers in the last 2 years. So, and I think this is interesting.
This is very interesting. And is there also a sense of international solidarity with tech workers in other countries, or do they identify much more with the Brazilian workers, other Brazilian workers?
So when we're talking in a general perspective, they have a very I mean, that it's very interesting when you say how you discover how you need to do something. Nowadays, you're going to ask some AI, but or you're going to go to GitHub to find some code. But usually they would say, see some Indian guy video. You know, if you want to learn how to do a specific task that you don't know, that you are going to look for some Indian tech worker tutorial of how to do this specific coding or demand or to attend this specific demand. So I think they realize that there is this global tradition of solidarity that is centered in knowledge sharing. And many of them also really consume the US culture. Most of them, some part of them want to immigrate at some point. You know, you have this brand drain in Brazil. That's a very serious challenge. So many of them also they consume a lot of YouTube channels, Discord channels of tech workers from the US, and we are starting also to have some kind of solidarity chance with tech workers from Latin America. This is a very small and recent movement, but we are started to learn with the Argentinian tech co-ops that they have a very large tradition in Argentina. We're starting to have some kind of initial open space of debate between Chilean, Colombian, Mexican tech workers and Brazilian ones. I mean, I'm talking about a minority of very organized and kind of radical leftist tech workers sectors, but it's interesting to think about it.
Can I flip that question over to the other side and ask Valentin, do you think that US and German tech workers that you've interviewed have a feeling of solidarity with workers in the global south, or do you think they see them as a threat that undercuts their working, their wages and conditions?
Both could be the case. I mean, when I talk, I didn't mention that before, but like the most people I talk to are organized tech workers, and I have to say, like Kenzo also mentioned before, this is still an exception. Like the people that organize in the tech sector, I think there is a shift towards seeing yourself as a worker. But organizing is still the exception. You still have a lot of people who don't think about organizing and who look at the social mobility aspect. And surely there are threats to employment, maybe seen as from the global south. I haven't seen that so much. It's more the threat of being replaced by AI and not having a job anymore. On the other side, like on the sort of labor movement side, I think there is a big effort, and I think that's also special about this tech worker movement. There is an effort for solidarity, cross-class solidarity, and also global solidarity, I believe. That is different from maybe IT worker movements or some of the IT worker movements in the past. So what I've seen, and that's interesting also with the definition of the tech worker, is that these many of these software engineers who were in the early part of the movement, try to expand this notion of the tech worker and say it's not just software engineers who have a full-time job at Google, but it's also the data entry workers in Kenya, for instance, who are doing much of the work that is very important for actually a technology product to function. So I think there is this element of solidarity. I don't know if there are too much. I mean, there are initiatives. I don't think they have become too practical yet. I think one transnational collective action that should be mentioned is the walkout at Google, which I think happened mostly on the global north, but was one of the, I think, biggest forms of collective action that happened worldwide. So people walked out of their offices, not just in the United States, but in Japan, in Geneva, in all, basically a lot of countries where Google or Alphabet has offices. And that was like a globally coordinated collective action, which I think is interesting from a viewpoint of transnational solidarity. Yeah. And then I think there is a consciousness that global South and global North solidarity is necessary for these struggles. But I also think these movements are usually in the very beginning and usually in conflicts with yeah, they are very local management, often in conflicts with their local and national unions. So there are really like a lot of issues that organized tech workers and with their colleagues who sometimes align with management. So there are really a lot of issues, I feel like, that organized tech workers are busy with, at least the ones that I meet.
Well, but of course, we have to. I mean, this is beyond the scope of the because it's happening so recently. So it's perhaps a little bit of an unfair question to raise to both of you. But against this, we have to set the role of Elon Musk's tech bros in attacking other workers in the United States in the current restructuring of government, what you could say, in the United States. And are there any signs, do you think, of other tech workers resisting this, or are the so to speak, the class conscious militant tech workers in a minority? Let's ask this question first to Valentin, and then Kenzo. Maybe you're in the United States too, so you probably both have a different take on it. But Valentin first, and then we'll come to you, Kenzo.
Yeah, I mean, I asked myself that question too. So first of all, I think the Musk takeover of Twitter, and then I mean subsequently also the U.S. state is an interesting example of how also labor relations are changing. I think the way Musk took over Twitter as a company and the political implications, they also might be a sign for the end of good, like a tech industry that wants to look good, that wants to have a good reputation, that leans more towards soft power and can also be hurt by reputational damage. I feel like companies like Musk-owned companies are not really resonant to the threat. And I think it also raises the question of migration. Like the information that I have is that the H-1B visas which are now being discussed about, are actually very important to keep the people that are still at Twitter or now X actually in the company. So I think from like a labor relations viewpoint, there are like many paradigm shifts that this could be a sign of. Doesn't have to be. In terms of the resistance against it, I haven't seen too much of it. I mean, there are, of course, Tech Workers Coalition. There are other political groups of tech workers who have um, organized protests against it. I think there was also a unionization effort at Twitter, which I don't know too much about. But also, it's maybe good to say that this is still also concerning Trump. I think this is also still in the beginning. When the tech workers movement was formed or became bigger in 2017, this was still, or 2018, 19, it took a while. It took some years to actually build ground. And maybe that's the same case here now. So I know of some actions and efforts, but I don't know of something too big, at least in the US. And then maybe from a local perspective in Berlin, we have since 2 or 3 years, I think, one of the only or the only Tesla plant in Europe, which is just outside of Berlin. And at least the organized tech workers here were very much in contact with the protest movements against this factory. So last year there was a big summer camp right in front of the factory, and they tried to. There were occupations of a forest that Musk was trying to destroy to enlarge the factory. So there is, I think, tech workers are part of an anti-Musk, anti-fascist coalition, but it's usually, them being part of a broader coalition.
Kenzo, what are you seeing? You're on the ground in New York. What is
Um,
happening?
So I will speak about this new scenario impacting the Brazilian tech workers community. Um, so I think for most of the workers that I interview in Brazil, consider that most of the Brazilian tech worker community uh, still reflects the what we call the Californian ideology that I think Elon Musk is the most relevant and famous propaganda agent right now of this ideology, this very techno solutionist perspective of society. But the new situation is very sensitive for two main the debates and concerns of the Brazilian tech workers community. The first one is immigration. So if we're talking about a community that depends on outsourcing work, and many of them dream of immigration to the global north, this new administration, this new U.S. administration perspective on closing the immigration opportunities, the immigration window. Although Trump said in many times that they are not going to close the door for qualified workers, and some of the Brazilian tech workers, they say, yeah, we are not these people that are going, through the river and through the desert from the Mexico border. We are qualified workers. We are very high skilled workers. But I think even these people, they start to realizing that maybe they are not. Like we had some AI specialists from Brazil having their visa denied from the new administration. So I think this is a huge and most relevant topic for Brazilian tech workers about the new administration positions. The other one is diversity. Many of the initiatives of the Brazilian tech workers collective mobilizations is about its focus on mentoring and giving more opportunities to women and Black people in the tech industry. So I think I'll do some. This is, of course, a struggle inside the tech community, and many of the Brazilian tech workers they say, we have this work culture that's dominating now every institution because it's a community that is still has a huge majority of white privileged workers. but in the movement, the relevance and the protagonism of Black and especially women was always very relevant in Brazil. And now this is a very contradictory situation because for one side, we had this problem of the IT companies having these nice speeches and some progress for women and for LGBTQ plus people, and now they are closing it. And especially they are closing funding for these initiatives of tech workers, of mentoring and education, IT education for these specific communities. And at the same time, this makes the grassroots movements that always had criticized this kind of funding become more powerful and more relevant. So it's interesting how this is changing the scenario of the tech works solidarity initiatives in Brazil right now.
Oh, that's very interesting. So there are basically two directions that these grassroots movements can go, I guess. It's the kind of political choice that faces us in so many different contexts. And one is to kind of fight from within, so to speak, to stay within the big tech companies and join unions and try to improve the situation. And the other is to leave and try to develop alternatives. Um, is there a tension between these two goals, or are people trying to combine the two? Or how do you see this going among the groups of people that you were studying in Brazil?
We have some struggles that I call inside and against the big techs. Like when tech workers, they realize the ethical and the social consequence of the workers in the life of the users and society in general, and they started resisting these choices, or even making huge critics to the core business model of their companies, especially when they realize that these nice speeches about AI for good and how IT companies, big techs, was founded by nerds guys with good ideas to change society, becoming not more, not they realize that there's speeches. What the people really cares about. It's to optimize the core business model. So one very interesting case is when a team of Brazilian tech workers were adapting some automatic filters for content moderation in a social network, in a social media platform, and they realized that there was a bias against LGBTQ people in this automatic filtering, like if some like LGBTQ people holding hands was equivalent to pornography content, to erotic content in these automatic filters, and they fought against this kind of bias. But unfortunately, many of these workers, they don't realize, or they don't believe they have the power to really make real changes inside the big tech companies, and they're starting to develop their own technologies. Brazil has this very rich, critical theoretical tradition of the education of the oppression, like against oppression of the oppressed people, and this made the very interesting tradition for tech workers to think, what is the technology of the oppressed? Like, how can we develop solutions for own communities? How we can think of developing tech to attend, and many of them are from the peripheral neighborhoods, the working class, the poor working class neighborhoods of the cities, of the slums, what in Brazil we call favelas. So they think we don't want to go live in the rich neighborhoods. We want to transform our communities through technology. And although this is a bit of techno solutionist perspective, it's at the same time a very interesting experience of developing co-op and common good tech solutions for communities. What's the problem? Funding. The problem is always funding. So they're starting to develop some pressure in the Brazilian governments to start rebuilding these national development policies of public procurement and credit, and support, general support for this co-op tax, co-op AI, and co-op platforms that these tech workers movements are trying to develop in Brazil. But it's all everything is very recent, like from the last 2 or 3 years. So we will see in the near future if it's going to succeed or not.
That's very, very, very interesting. But as an alternative, it's a kind of voluntarist kind of solution, the setting up cooperatives and so on. Is there any debate about a more kind of large scale decommodification, like the kind of demands, which you saw in Chile in early 70s, for example, of setting up systems, nationalized systems under public control or under municipal control at a smaller level? Are any of these kinds of alternative models being discussed?
Yeah, I'm from Rio de Janeiro, and in Rio we have a public platform for taxi drivers that like Uber or other platform, but it's a public one. The municipal government developed it with a public tech company that we already had as a legacy from the 78s, 90s, early 90s development policies, and it has 8,000 drivers using every day this platform. It already made more than 1 million trips. So it's, I think, a success example, but I think it is still a fragmented initiative. So some municipal governments, some state governments has some kind of interesting initiatives, and the federal government in the last 2 years they had a lot of promises and that they would support the co-op tech movement and the co-op platform movement, but we had some like the labor ministry. They published a document about what they call digital solidarity initiatives, but we didn't see these nice intentions become a real public policy. We are still waiting, and the tech workers are still making pressure to these kind of nice intentions documents become real policies, so we can become scaling these initiatives. So if we have a platformer that works for Rio de Janeiro's drivers, why we cannot make this a national platform for each city to implement this, to apply this? We still didn't see this happens. But yeah, I think it's a problem. The tech workers, they are making pressure for this to happen.
Oh, that's so interesting. But we mustn't stray too far away from the content of this special issue. And before we finish, Valentin, you put together an amazing collection of articles. Perhaps you could very quickly take us through what the topics that are addressed by some of the other articles in the special issue.
Yeah, sure. So we have overall 7 articles, including an introduction. Yeah, our introduction is an introduction. It gives an overview, but I think it's worth reading because we talk a little bit about um, the up-to-date or like sort of current issues that relate to tech workers and tech worker struggles. Then I would just take the chronology that we have in the issue. So we have an article by myself, which I've talked a bit about on this notion of the tech worker. What is a tech worker? What do researchers think is a tech worker? What do tech workers that call themselves think is a tech worker? So I think that's maybe interesting to start with. Then we have an article by Felix Gnieser, who also was a co-editor of this issue, where he looks at the role of tech workers as technology producers in social conflicts. He mainly looks at the history, I would say, of how technical workers in social conflicts have been looked at and theorized. And I think um, it's interesting. He makes these 3 perspectives. The one perspective is what he calls the proletarianization perspective. So looking at tech workers, the way we talked a bit about them now, there's crisis, there's layoffs, and tech workers suddenly also realize they're part of the working class or workers. But then there's also other perspectives like being part of a company and taking decisions on technology, which is very current issue at the moment with a lot of accusations of war crimes for technology. That's something the tech workers movement brought up. So what kind of technology is produced? And then also workplace democracy, which has been a critique that technical workers have been voicing. So I think that's an interesting article. Then yeah, next article is the one by Kenzo, which he talked a bit already about, and which I really recommend. Like really a lot of nice empirical insights. We have an article by Paula Bialski, who looks at tech workers a bit from an STS perspective and looks at what she calls the materiality of software and how it influences work in tech, but also conflicts. So how maybe conflicts are played out or negotiated through software or behind code. And I would say maybe a bit like labor process theory looks at assembly line or other forms of technologies. Paula looks from an STS perspective at how software shapes conflicts in software companies and tech companies. And then we have two articles that are concerned with the situation in Germany or Europe and automobile producers, which might sound specific, but I think is also interesting for other fields. So we have an article by Martin Kuczynski, Sabine Pfeiffer, and colleagues. They compare the classical German engineer, which has its own cult. I think there's a cult around tech workers, but there's also a cult in Germany around engineers. So they kind of compare how these two groups come along in automobile companies. And it's, I think, interesting because I think the traditional automobile engineers, they are starting to lose a bit of their leverage and power because cars become more and more tech products. And tech workers, software engineers will have or have since a few years a bit more power. So there are no negotiation processes going on and identification processes going on, and they are sort of looking at that, which I think was like a very interesting perspective. And then the last article is by Nina Hussein, who looks at also the automobile industry and factories who are producing for the main auto factories. And I think she looks at how these agile work methods and these work methods that basically come from Silicon Valley are being introduced in traditional auto manufacturing companies, and how that actually doesn't work. How people actually resist on taking the subjectivity of lean entrepreneurial, maybe software engineer. I think maybe that's an interesting thing about tech work in general, that it produces subjectivities that also become attractive in other fields. And what the article shows, I think, by Nina Hussein, is that sometimes that also doesn't work because people are also resisting these efforts, not necessarily because of increasing worker power, but maybe because of other reasons that might be interesting. So I think that's a bit of an overview of all the articles. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And finally, I think we always try, when you write an academic article, you always try to end with a paragraph about future research. You know, what can you learn from all this and build on for future research? Because obviously everybody's looking for their next funding grant. the we've now arrived at a situation in the world where many of the largest companies in the world are these enormous global tech companies who combine, and it's something I'm doing some work on, they combine in a unique way commodity production with rent extraction within the same corporation in a way that is almost historically unique. It's almost like a new phase of capitalism, we could argue. And increasingly, there's a sense in which all workers have to be tech workers, in the sense that the kind of the digital has entered so many labor processes across so many industries and so many aspects of daily life. Um, so, but yet we still have this idea of the tech worker as some special kind of worker who sits at the heart of all this. Given that context, uh, I'm going to ask you first, Kenzo, what do you see as the key things that researchers should be studying to try to understand the future of work and technology?
So the first is the impact of AI in this labor market, because a very clear thing for Brazilians is that the pandemic and also the AI development were like tipping points in the market. So now what they call themselves like senior or full stack developers or data scientists, they are still calm, thinking we are still needed. But when you think about juniors workers, like the ones that are starting in this path, in this career, they say these people we don't need anymore, or at least we don't need in the scale that they were needed in the past before the AI revolution. So at the same time, they think a lot of AI it's just propaganda, that we are not near close to the huge developments that the big tech companies are promising. But at the same time, it's a reality that like salaries are already being impacted by the pressure of automatization of especially these more lower and beginning positions in the IT industry and in the software industry. So I think this is interesting and relevant to study. And the other things is like, as you said, it's an international chain of production. So how we can study the articulations and the solidarity initiatives of workers of this whole chain to understand each other as part of a working class and a part of the same movement against and also making alternatives to the big tax models. So how the data workers unionization process in Kenya and in Africa can be organized with the tech workers that analyze the data and the development, the models that they are training in Brazil, because that's a very interesting thing. We have this global chain that organizes and articulates the labor in many different dozens of different countries in the global south. So I think it's interesting to make more visible the connections, the invisible connections between this working class global force and for themselves think as a global working class that must organize themselves in this kind of international perspective that is one of the long traditions of the working class to think as an international class. So let's see if this happens or not. And it's important to study also failure. I mean, it's important not just to study the success histories, but also which co-ops of tech workers failed, for what reasons. This is another very interesting research question that I'm trying to study more in the last few months.
Thank you. Valentin, what are your 3 bullet points for future research?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question that you asked, but a good one. And I think especially with the political developments that you mentioned happening worldwide, I think we have to rethink the relationship between labor and politics. I mean, maybe in a way that work organization, labor and globalization as a journal has been doing it ever since. But I think to an extent that maybe labor sociology or science hasn't been doing so much. I think what we've seen with the political power of tech executives and tech companies um, makes clear that we are not just talking about a labor issue. And I think that becomes very clear with the tech workers movement. What they do is not only unionize and building works councils and all that kind of things. They realize, the people I talk to realize that the implementations or the implications of these business models are political, and they cannot be solved only with a trade unionist approach. They cannot be solved by only looking at the workplace and things like algorithmic management. All of that is important, but I think the intersection and the relationship between labor and politics has become more important. I think that's why the tech industry has become more important in, unfortunately, a very bad way.
Great. Well, on that cheerful note, thank you both very, very much.
Thank
And
you.
I do encourage all viewers to take a look at this special issue. It's got some really interesting stuff in it. Thank you very much. Bye.